Okay, and
alrighty. Hello, everybody. My name is Erica Granadino, and I'm a state park interpreter here in the beautiful Humboldt Redwoods State Park. And we are located in the ancestral territory of the native Lollinkok Sinkyone peoples. And today we're going to talk about who saved the Redwoods. It's not a simple question. And it has not a simple answer either. It's not just kind of one answer fits all thing. So through this program, we're going to talk about some of these groups and some of these people that made conserving old growth redwoods possible. As you can see above me, it's a little bit rainy today. And that is because we are in a temperate rainforest. I thought that rainforest only existed in the Amazon until I started working here. And then come to find out that North America has the largest temperate rainforest in the world. Right now, we are kind of in the southern end. So we're barely kind of cutting it close to this temperate rainforest. But here, we basically get a lot of water. That's what that means. We received anywhere from 80 to 100 inches of rain per year. And the coast redwood, being the tallest tree in the world. Oh, sorry, my tripod. It can reach heights of up to 350 feet. How tall is that, you may ask? Well, if you think of a football field and you count both end zones, that is just how tall these trees can get. And in some cases, even taller. And they can get that tall because there's a lot of rain. And it's the perfect kind of temperature. These trees only grow along a 400-mile coastal strip between Central California, so around like the Bay Area, all the way up to Southern Oregon. Keeping an eye out, there's been branches falling, and I definitely want to not be around when that happens. Anyway, back to the story. Coast redwoods can live up to 2,500 years old and kind of have this perfect kind of year-round growing conditions in this 400-mile coastal strip where they live or where they occur. And they're really cool trees. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them because we're going to talk about who saved the redwoods. So how can we come to understand why people felt so compelled to protect this tree? I mean, there's trees all over the world, right? There's many other kinds of trees in California, but why the coast redwood? Why this tree? Why was it so important that people at some point wanted to conserve this from its undemise, of its kind of early demise, right? But let's learn a little bit more about this tree and some of its awesome other kind of things that happen here in the coast redwood forest. So coast redwood trees are red, right? We know them because if you see this redwood, you'd be like, oh, that's a redwood tree. And so coast redwoods have this iconic redwood, and it comes from a special chemical called tannins. Tannins are not only what make the coast redwood red, but they also serve another really special purpose. And that is because the tannins that are found in the wood not only help coast redwoods be resistant to a lot of diseases and funguses, but most importantly, the tannins and the amount of water that the thick bark holds help redwoods be resistant to fire. So this little kind of cavity that is in this big old growth redwood tree, because this is what an old growth looks like. As you can tell, most of this trail has been logged, right? This is the second growth or second story redwood forest. And what do I mean by that? I mean that there are slightly younger trees. Some of this area has been logged before. But here, we have an old growth on the trail. And you can see a lot of some of the adaptations, right? The old growth redwood and redwood trees in general have. So not only can you see the burnt out hollowed tree, but you can also see the reiteration from the roots, from the base of the tree. This is technically a clone of this parent tree. So redwoods not only grow from a seed cone, which If we look at the ground, we can find one right here. These are the tiny seed cones that give life to the tallest tree in the world. But they're not the most common way that redwood trees can grow. In fact, they're not even the best way that they grow. The best way, like I said, is they clone themselves. So they don't even need a seed or a seed cone to do what they need to do. They can simply sprout from the base of their own tree. But there's something else happening here aside from a burnt out hollowed tree and aside from this clone. We also see this like weird lumpy formation. And it's really distinctive. And a lot of old growth redwood trees have this. This is what you call a redwood burl. This is basically, I like to tell kids, it's like a redwood boo-boo. So this tree was disturbed, whether it was maybe another tree that fell on it. Maybe it was a flood. Maybe it was a fire, right? Many things could occur in a redwood forest. And this is basically kind of like a redwood boo-boo. So it basically wants to kind of protect itself. And a lot of these burls can also, with enough stress, they can sprout up other baby trees. So it's a stress response to, kind of conditions that happen in their lives, right? So it could be many things that cause this tree to be stressed. But most importantly, even under these stressful conditions, it helps give life to other things. So it's a really cool kind of ability that redwood trees have. And I talked about fire, and fire is super important in this environment. As you can see, we have a lot of trees that fall, right? We have branches that fall. We have leaf litter that falls. Basically, that makes for a really good campfire. And so the native people, in order to kind of regularly manage these places and to ensure that they had healthy forests with different kinds of ages of trees, right? You had big trees, baby trees, infant trees, toddler trees, teenager trees, adult trees, older elderly trees. That's what you need to have a healthy forest, right? You need to have a composition of different kinds of trees. And the coast redwoods, we now know, are pretty prolific when they grow. They kind of grow like weeds, if you may think of it like that. And so in order to have a healthy forest, right, with an understory of edible and kind of plants, right, that you want to select for, they had to regularly burn these forests because redwoods can grow really densely and really fast. And so this is a really dangerous forest when it comes to a wildfire. And fire is part of California landscape, and it has been for thousands of years. And so native people, they kind of would jump the gun, right? You fight fire with fire. How do you prevent a really big fire? Well, you got to have a lot of little fires. So when there is a fire that's not intentional, right? Like a lightning storm, then a lot of that brush and dead kind of material and plant litter has been burnt off. So that is the problem that we're seeing in California today, is the suppression of fire regimes, and especially the suppression of indigenous fires, right? That is what has led to the conditions that are just like ready for any fire to sprout. So that's why they would burn, they would burn these places every 5 to 20 years. That is how often they would burn these forests. And you can see, right, if you burn these places that often, you can see how some of these trees would have big holes and big caves that people could go into. So those are really great examples that tell us visually, wow, these places were they were like being burned really often, right? Because in order to have a really big goose pin, and we got some friends in the back, you need to have a lot of fires, right? So a big hollowed out tree, that already tells me that that was many fire events that happened. And it's a great tool, right, to manage these forests. But they did it for other reasons too. They did it to, like I said, have select for different kinds of understory plants, right, that are medicinal or edible. Also, it helps encourage new growth of different kinds of species, different kind of growth, right? Like if after a fire, huckleberries actually grow really straight. And what do you think that they may have done with these straight kind of plants? Basketry, arrows, right? So by actually burning, you would create certain kinds of growth of plants that already grow there, but they grow in a certain way that is useful. So fire was done for that. And most importantly, to encourage a diversity of animals and wildlife. They would actually burn prairies, right? Because they didn't have a truck or a truck bed to, shoot their deer, put it in the truck and take it home with them. They needed to create the environment, like the grazing environment, so that these kind of grazing animals can come towards them and they wouldn't have to go out to find them and then bring them back in. So they did it for many reasons, but the main reason why they would do that, as we talked about before, was to prevent big forest fires. So we're gonna go kind of walk around to a part of our forest that has a tree that has been logged. Because, as I said, the native people, right, of California, of the North Coast, we had many tribes here. In fact, the North Coast was one of the most culturally diverse places in the Americas, really. And it was because there was a rugged terrain where kind of tribes could live in isolation from one another, right? Because there was so much going on, thick underbrush, thick understory, and also wonderful places to be, right? With a lot of bounty, with rivers that have so many salmon that it looks silver, right? All of these wonderful places created this diverse of native cultures that we had at some point here in the North Coast. But something started to happen around the 1500s. We started seeing an influx of newcomers, right? Of immigrants, of people that wanted to be settlers. So they weren't just coming to visit, they were coming to stay. And they had a different worldview. It wasn't the same as the native people had. They didn't see coast redwoods as their relatives, right? They didn't see them as part of their family. That's how native people saw nature and the coast redwood. They know it to be alive. It had a spirit. It was their ancestors, right? So they really, really wanted to protect these places. However, these new people that were coming, their worldview was so different that they didn't understand why native people were burning, why they lived the ways that they lived back then. They didn't understand that fire wasn't careless. It was a land management tool, right? A really smart one. Now we're starting to realize the big mistake that we made, right? By suppressing these forests all over California from fire, because now we're seeing really horrible fires, that it's because of 200 years of fire suppression. But we're learning, right? We're learning now. We are reintroducing fire and traditional ecological knowledge back to these landscapes to ensure that they're going to have a future, right? But these newcomers started doing something different, and you can see it right behind me. This is what they started doing to these coast redwood trees. They started to log them. So I'm gonna kind of move around to this side because it's got a feature that I want to show you guys. So can you guys see these little notches? So this is a great example of how coast redwoods used to be logged back in the day, right? Back in the day, they didn't have the technology to cut a tree from the base, especially these old growth redwoods that aren't really straight from the bottom. You know, they're kind of curly. Some of them aren't really, they have these burls, right? That's not straight wood. So back then, they used to kind of get on these platforms. Do you guys see these platforms? They're about a couple of feet up from the base. So men, back in these logging times, they used to get on these platforms and put little notches in them. And so these little notches are these platforms that people used to make. So you can see some of the old remnants of logging that happened in our park. Nowadays, they have the technology, so they don't have to cut them from this part, right? They can do it from the base. So that is a good telltale sign of how you know if something was logged a long time ago versus maybe today. So unfortunately, it only took 80 years for most of the old growth redwoods, so most of the redwoods that were around, to start being cut down. And here I have another awesome picture. These trees, most of the redwoods at this time were old growth, right? Because Native people typically wouldn't log them, right? They would wait for them to fall. And that is inevitable because these trees have very shallow roots. So they don't go that deep. They only go about 10 feet, even for these big trees. So they're not that deep. So how redwoods stabilize is they kind of intertwine their roots with other trees. So never plant a redwood tree ornamentally if you don't plan on having other trees around it, because it's going to fall and you don't want that. And it grows really fast. So they started to be logged, right? And it only took about 80 years from around 1849, when people really started coming to California, to the 1900s, to only have 4.6% of those left. So 80 years, right? Less than 100 years that it took from having 100% of these awesome old growth redwood trees to now only having 4.6%. That was a really drastic change. And people started to notice, right? People started to notice. The Native people had already been noticing, but now you have these sons and daughters of settlers and pioneers that grew up playing in these awesome forests that now are like taken back and starting to see what is happening to their new home. Right now you have new people that are calling these places their home. And now we need a hero, right? Because it seems like if we let these new kind of industries take over without having some sort of like, you know, restrictions on them, or without stopping some of the things that are happening, it seems like we're pretty much going to be screwed, right? Most of these trees are going to get cut down. So we need somebody to stand up for these trees. And that is when we had a very important group stand up. And believe it or not, it was women's clubs and groups. They were the first non-Indigenous kind of advocates for the conservation of old growth redwoods. And I like to ask this question. I know some of you guys are kind of don't have your camera on, but if you want to type it in the chat or just kind of say it, that's cool. You guys probably might know this, but why back then, around the 1900s, why did women have to join clubs and groups? What was happening around this time that women had to join these clubs and groups? Couldn't they maybe just run for office? What are some of these basic civil rights that women didn't have in the 1900s that we do today? Yeah, so Margaret said women were trying to get the right to vote, right? So around this time, the reason why we had so many women's clubs and groups pretty much sprouting all over the United States was because women didn't have the right to vote. So in order for a woman in any community to be a leader, to be engaged in civic, duties and activities within your community, you couldn't just do that just by, running for office or being in city council. You had to join in clubs and groups because that was the only way your message was really going to be heard. So all over the United States, women's clubs and groups were everywhere around this time. So think 1900s, every major city or town had a women's club or group in it. This is going to be really important when it came to protecting and conserving these trees. And why would it be important that we have clubs of women all over the world? And if you look at them, you might notice something, right? These women, well, mainly, right? They're white, right? They look like they have money. And simply the fact that they have the time to devote to these causes, they definitely weren't your Mary Jane working 12 hours at a radium factory painting dials, right? So there was definitely kind of a very obvious privilege that a lot of these women that were in women's clubs and groups had, right? A lot of them were married to politicians. A lot of them were married to lawyers, right? Married to people that were publishers and newspapers. Basically, what I want to say is that the women that were in these clubs and groups typically had some privilege and some leverage. It wasn't your typical person that was part of these groups. In fact, some of these women's clubs and groups were very like exclusive, right? Unless you were somewhat like an important family in your community, you probably weren't getting in. And a lot of women of color definitely weren't getting in, so much so that they had to come up with their own women's clubs and groups in order to be in a club and a group, right? So there was, clubs and groups for women of color because these kinds of clubs and groups weren't allowing them to be. But what I want to talk about is utilizing privilege, right? To get your voices heard, because that is what these women did, right? Of course, some of them were kind of exclusionary. Maybe they weren't the best people, right? Maybe their heart really wasn't in protecting these trees. Maybe they just joined the club and group because it was the fancy thing to do. Because if you were anybody or anyone in your community, that's what you did, right? Because a lot of women, didn't go to school, right? They were kind of housewives. So this was a way that they can be civic leaders in their community. And they started to do so here in the North Coast. And some of these clubs and groups that advocated for the conservation of redwoods obviously were the ones here in Humboldt County. So it was the Eureka Women's Club, right? These were the clubs and groups that were advocating for the conservation of redwoods. So you guys can see here, this is a picture of one of like the main ways that they kind of got their message out. They actually, like I said, they're fancy women, right? So they had a fancy car in their beautiful dresses and they paraded around every single town in Humboldt County with this sign that said Save the Redwoods, with a chauffeur, of course, nothing else, right? And it just kind of goes to show, right? Like the kind of power and privilege that these women really had, right? They didn't protest in the way that we see protests today. They definitely did it in a more fancy version. But nonetheless, these women strategized many ways to help conserve these redwoods, mainly because they didn't have the right to vote. So they really had to kind of use their brain power to be like, what are we going to do? Like, how are we going to protect these trees? And they did so in many ways, right? As you can see, they had marches, right? They held rallies, they wrote speeches, they wrote newspaper articles, they had their own, newsletter for the California Federation of Women's Clubs, right? So they utilized pretty much every avenue of media in order to get their message across. So much so that they even got the US Postmaster General at the time to allow them to stamp every single piece of outgoing mail from Humboldt County with a stamp that said, Save the Redwoods. How crazy is that? Like, even to this day, I don't think we could leverage that much power to get a whole county, every single piece of mail to get stamped, Save the Redwoods. Just kind of goes to show the kind of leverage and power that some of these women really had if they were able to get the Postmaster General of the United States to allow them to stamp every single piece of mail that left Humboldt County with Save the Redwoods. There's been movements to this day that have started with less, right? Imagine, there's been hashtags that have started movements. So imagine if every TikTok, every Snapchat, every Facebook post that you made in your county, if you were obligated to put hashtag Save the Redwoods, just imagine how many people would hear about that. So these women are really smart, basically is what I'm trying to say. And they came up with awesome ways to really get their message across. Some of these grassroots efforts were really the first of its kind and really kind of were the first to be used in this way, especially for the environment, and are still used to this day, right? They wrote petitions. They had children write letters to the president. They did so many other things. Ultimately, though, the federal government, around this time, they were also starting the national park system, and a lot of places were being conserved to be national parks. And do you guys think the women of the North Coast Redwoods asked for this to be a national park? Heck yeah, they did. That was the first thing that they wanted to do. They were like, okay, well, they're starting all these parks all over the nation. Why don't we advocate so the redwoods can get protected too? Oh, trust me, they tried that. But the federal government was like, yeah, like we know where you're coming from, but like these trees cost a lot of money now and we sold them for like nothing. And now we don't have the money to buy them back. So that became the problem. The problem was that a lot of old growth redwood lands, because they were trying to get them settled, right? They were trying to displace the kind of people that were there with the people that they wanted. They sold them for like a ridiculous amount of money. Like an old growth redwood acre costs like $1.25. A lot of old growth redwood lands was also illegally surveyed by a lot of kind of crooked people. So they said that they would be wetlands or marshlands, and they got rid of a lot of old growth redwoods. Long story short, all coast redwood lands were now private. They were private property and somebody owned them. So now when the women and the people and philanthropists, right, these clubs and groups were like, Save the Redwoods, the federal government was like, we do not have the money to buy back what we sold for very, very little. So that's where it became really important that these women not only had power, privilege, they also had money, and they had connections to other groups and philanthropists and people that also had a lot of money. So this is the Save the Redwood League. And a lot of you guys have probably heard about the Save the Redwood League when it comes to the conservation of redwoods. And the reason why I do my program is because they weren't the first to advocate. In fact, their reason to conserving the redwood wasn't because it was kind of a way to get into the political arena that they had never been able to do before. It wasn't because, you know, they had lived here and they wanted to protect some of these trees, like the club in Humboldt County. The women had lived here. They wanted to protect it. They did it because the founders of the Save the Redwood League, so Madison Grant, and I forget the names of the John C. Merriam and the other dude, they wanted to save the coast redwood because they believed in eugenics. Eugenics is a belief that certain species of animals or, you know, beings is more dominant than others. So they believe the coast redwoods were pretty much like the apex species of all trees, kind of like the white. They pretty much utilize white supremacy to relate to coast redwood trees. They even wrote a book on it that Hitler called his Bible. So these men had a very kind of dark motivation to wanting to save these coast redwood trees. It was basically a racist belief. Now the Save the Redwood League, who still is one of the major land trusts that conserves redwood, they have completely denounced that. They do great work in terms of conservation and inclusivity and diversity, but their founders were those people, right? There were these racist people. And so that's why I do my program, because they weren't even the first. They were just the bandwagoners and they had enough power, but the women were the ones that did all the hard work. They were the ones that campaigned, wrote articles, had conventions of women, fundraise money from 50-cent dues from women all over California to fundraise the thousands of dollars that it took to buy several groves here in my park. But there is one final story that I'm going to kind of share with you guys. And this is the story of one hero. Obviously, the women were really important and they did a lot. But you can kind of see how maybe some of these women just were in a club because it was a cool, fancy thing to be. And if you were anybody who's anybody, that's what you did, right? But there's one woman who I'm going to finish off my story with. And her name is Laura Mahan. This is your hero here. This is your heroine for this program. And why Laura Mahan? She died way before you were born. How do you even know that she really meant and was passionate about these trees and didn't just do it because she was a rich lady, right? Well, I'm going to tell you a story about Laura Mahan. And as I tell you the story, I'm going to start walking back to my little umbrella. So why Laura Mahan? Well, Laura Mahan not only was the leader of the women here in Humboldt County, right? So she wasn't just part of the club, she was leading them, right? So that tells you, okay, so she's obviously has a lot of responsibility with this movement. So she must care a lot. But that's not the only thing Laura Mahan did. She had been fighting for this years before it became a mainstream movement. In fact, Laura Mahan had been unsuccessful, right? She had places that she tried to conserve and save that ended up being logged. So Laura Mahan did a lot, but I guess what I'm trying to say is her movement didn't go too far until maybe other people started getting involved in it. But she really had a good kind of motivator, and it was because she really cared about these trees. Laura Mahan grew up here, not too far from here, and within her childhood, she started to see that her favorite play place was all being logged. She wanted to do something about it, and she had the power and the privilege to do it. And Laura Mahan, was the leader of all these women and, did a lot, right? But there was one thing that Laura Mahan did, and this is how I really know that she wasn't in it just for the fame and glory. So story goes that the conservation movement was going somewhere, right? People were buying out old growth redwood trees. Even the Humboldt County Chamber of Commerce was like, ooh, we're logging all these trees. Pretty soon, we're not going to have a good economy. But this whole, visitor, right? All of these people that are coming and visiting just to see these trees, maybe there's something in it, right? So pretty much all of this area, Humboldt County, they started to see, we need to protect these trees. Pretty soon, we're not going to have many of them left. So logging companies even started to wait for these women and other clubs to give them the money so that they can buy out old growth redwood trees. So things were looking good, right? Things were looking good. Laura Mahan and her women were happy, but some of these companies weren't really being honest. In fact, one company in particular lied to them and started to cut down a part of the forest that they were not supposed to. In fact, they promised that they weren't going to touch it. They weren't going to log it until Save the Redwood League and the women and all these other people had enough money to buy it. But of course they lied, right? They were sneaky. They were like, oh, maybe we can get one or two or maybe a couple more trees before we do the deal. But our girl, Laura Mahan, was not going to have this. She was like, heck no, I'm going to go find out. So she heard a rumor from a friend of a friend of a friend, right? Because back then it wasn't just like, I'm going to text you here, I'm going to go Facebook Live and you can see what's happening. She heard from somebody who heard from somebody that they actually started to cut down this area that they promised that they weren't going to. So Laura Mahan was pissed. She was like, we got to go find out if this is true. So Laura Mahan and her husband, James Mahan, came all the way to, I guess, Dyerville. That's kind of the area in our park where it happened. And what do you think happened? These trees were being cut down, right? It just happened to be true. What they wanted to not be true was in fact true. So Laura Mahan, instead of being like, okay, we're going to go get the cops and the authorities. Okay, husband, let's go figure this out. She was like, heck no, I'm going to go up there and like face off with these loggers. I'm going to climb a stump and I'm going to wait there until my husband can come back with the authorities. And that took hours. So Miss Laura Mahan legit stood off and faced off these loggers for hours before her husband and the authorities can stop what was happening. So her putting her life on the line, this is what really tells me that Miss Laura Mahan, she wasn't just walking the walk, right? She was talking the talk. She wasn't just in it because she was a rich, fancy woman that wanted purpose. She did this because she really cared about these trees. And by physically putting herself in harm's way, that is how a person that was born way after her, that's how I can tell that she was really passionate about these trees. And thankfully, all of the work that these women did alongside, Save the Redwood League and other club women all over the state and all over the nation that sent 50-cent, 25-cent dues to buy out old growth redwood groves, that is what in turn saved these trees, right? It was all of their hard work and the money that these groups were able to fundraise to preserve these places. And there's one last thing that I think it's a really cool fun fact, and you guys are like the older crowd, so you might understand it. So it was, how many of you guys have ever been to a park, maybe in California, and you've seen a memorial grove? Something memorial grove. How many of you guys have seen memorial, like a grove is a group of trees, right? So you've probably seen it. Guess whose idea that was? It was a club woman from San Rafael. So around this time, it was the turn of the century, right? World War I had just ended around this time. And there was a lot of people that people wanted to commemorate. And there was a club woman from San Rafael, and I forget her name, but she was like, hey, you know, we want to protect all these places. Why don't we come up with the idea of Memorial Grove? So it was her idea to come up with this idea to have people, right, buy out a little place with a couple of trees or some land with old growth redwood trees, and to name it after their fallen loved one, right? So this whole idea of memorial groves, if you ever go to a lot of like state parks here, you'll see memorial groves pretty much anywhere. And you can be sure that that was a women's idea of protecting these trees. So women really were the first non-Indigenous advocates when it comes to old growth redwood conservation. But unfortunately today, the Save the Redwood League, right? These kind of like racist founders get a lot of the credit, and it's really not fair. So in our park, we have the California Federation of Women's Clubs Grove, right? So that's one. We also have the Garden Club of America Grove. We have the Native Daughters of the West. So, and then we also have the Julia Morgan Hearthstone, which is, any of you guys know Julia Morgan? She did the Hearst Castle. So Julia Morgan was the first female architect in California, the first licensed. And these women commissioned her to kind of build a Hearthstone in the middle of their grove to commemorate. Like, this is a women's kind of movement, and this is a for women kind of building. So it was our park is a really special place because we have several places that were either bought out by a women's club or group, or it was a memorial grove that was bought by, you know, maybe a woman in a family. So I don't think it's fair that the founders have gotten a lot of the credit as much as they have to this day, and they still do. And that's why I was like, I'm going to do a program where we talk about the Laura Mahans, right? We talk about the women's clubs and groups that were the first, and maybe they didn't have that kind of really dark motivation that other groups like the Save the Redwood League had. So thankfully, we had people at this time, right? Like these women that had the privilege, right? And the power to utilize, to protect these trees. Because of course, the native lowland Coxsackie and the native Californians wanted to protect their homelands, but they couldn't. Their voices were being ignored, and their voices weren't being heard because they were under constant like attack, right? They were in fear for their lives. So they weren't going to use their voice. They couldn't. But these people could. And so the moral of the story is we all have a voice that we can utilize to help something or someone that maybe their voices aren't being heard. Today, it's not just the coast redwood that needs help. There are so many other places, plants, animals that are on the brink of extinction and endangered. And maybe they don't have a voice. Maybe there's no one advocating for them. But we have the voice that we can use to help other things whose voices maybe aren't being heard. So thank you guys so much for listening to my spiel on why women rock. And if you guys have any questions, I'd love to answer them. I think we have like 4 minutes.
So I have a couple more questions. So Laura Mahan, it makes sense why she was interested, but why were the other women's groups so interested in conservation?
Yes. So like I said, women's groups were kind of all over the place. And the women's clubs and groups here, they focus kind of on the coast redwood. But a lot of other like state parks and national parks, like for example, Humboldt, San Francisco Bay, it was conserved by a women's group in the Bay Area. So women's clubs and groups, a lot of them championed for a lot of historical and natural sites all over the United States. And it was because they didn't have this right to vote, right? And at the time, the only areas, right, that women were technically allowed to be a part of women's clubs and groups was education and gardening. But women, they were like gardening, conservation, forestry thing, right? They were like, that's the same. We're going to do that too. So it kind of ended up merging into this like movement of also forest conservation. So a lot of these women's clubs and groups, you know, they had a certain scope that men and these kinds of systematic structures wanted them to do, but they kind of wiggled through those parameters a little bit. And it was really important that there were these clubs and groups all over the state and the nation, because the whole California Federation of Women's Clubs Groups, so for like the whole system for the entire state, right, they would have annual conferences. And guess who fought to have an annual conference here in the Redwoods, right? So it was also the ability, it was so helpful to have women all over, because then they could come. And they don't have an investment in the North Coast, right? They don't have property. So it's easier for someone from LA to be like, oh my God, it's beautiful. Yes, conserve it. Than it is for someone that maybe, you know, your parents were loggers. Maybe you have ranching in this area, right? You have more of an investment in the place. But if you seek out help from places and women that are in other places all over the country and the state, they're more likely to kind of support you, because they don't have that sort of thing, you know, where they're like, ooh, like what, you know, we're going to lose money. So yeah, that was a really important factor, that these women's clubs and groups were all over, because they were able to fundraise, right? Women all over the state were sending in money, 25, 10 cents. Pretty soon that adds up.
Oh, that's really interesting. I never thought of that. But yeah, if you're financially dependent on it, it's going to be a different story. Interesting. And then my second question for you is, how do you guys do fire management now?
Yeah, so today we do controlled burns, right? That's kind of what they're called. And usually it's like our maintenance, our like California Conservation Corps, sometimes a CAL FIRE will come. And so that is mostly in the natural resource department. But how we do fires is we do them when it's like the rainy, not the fire season, basically. So we wait until after the fire season. And, you know, they just have to have enough people, right, to make sure that it is controlled. And they're trained professionals, you know, they're starting to reintegrate those kinds of techniques, whereas before they weren't reintroducing fires. But yeah, I mean, I think just like a month ago, we did a couple of control burns here in our park. So we're doing it in our park and in our district for sure, because we're seeing these fires happening. And, you know, if we don't get on it first, there's going to be a fire that might come next summer, you know, and if we don't kind of help protect and burn off some of this like dead wood, it could be really dangerous. So yeah, CAL FIRE's definitely doing them. I know that our maintenance guys do them. I know that California Conservation Corps also does them. So there's definitely many like multi-agencies within our state that are also doing those things. So yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this awesome program. I think the County of San Luis Public Library really appreciates this amazing program.